So today I want to go over what I think is the best Druid build in Diablo 4, which is a Tornado Werewolf build. And this is more of a base version of this build that you can use as a base template to then go modify if you're trying to do more specialized things in the game, such as going and killing the level 100 Pinnacle boss or trying to do level 100 Nightmare dungeons. This is a very good base that with some modifications you can tailor it to do whatever you want. But even as a base, this build is ridiculously strong for basically everything. Now for this build to be optimal, you're going to need one unique item, which is Tempest Roar. The special effect is a lucky hit chance. Storm skills have up to a 25% chance to grant Force Spirit, and then your base storm skills are also now werewolf skills. And the lucky hit effect is incredibly strong for being able to spam as many tornadoes as we possibly can. And then all of our storm skills also being werewolf skills mean we can have massive amounts of additional scaling because we're going to be in werewolf basically all the time. Now the main aspect for this build is Grizzly Rage now shapeshifts you into a dire werewolf, giving you move speed instead of damage reduction, which is nice to be able to move around quickly. But the main part of this is you also gain up to 75% spirit cost reduction. Now with our different effects that are going to give us spirit from using our tornadoes and our other abilities and just our general spirit generation, having this on your necklace should be enough to allow you to infinitely spam tornadoes while in Grizzly Rage if you're at least hitting one target. And that being the case means we don't need to put this on our weapon, we can keep it on our amulet because we have enough spirit cost reduction, and then we get to put a different aspect for more damage on our weapon. And next up we have our skill tree, and like I mentioned, this is going to be more of a base version. There's easily some parts you can change up for whatever needs you're trying to currently go for. But first off we have our generator Storm Strike, just a basic generator, and one of the main parts of this is it gives us 25% damage reduction for 3 seconds. This is actually going to be a pretty big damage reduction, and it's also going to cause us to want to be using Storm Strike every 3 seconds, even if we don't need the spirit. We actually rarely have to use this to actually generate ourselves spirit, but the damage reduction is pretty massive. Then upgrade 1, it has a chance to mobilize. Upgrade 2, it has a chance to cause vulnerable, and this also cleaves to multiple enemies, so it can cause multiple enemies to become vulnerable. Then we're going down, we're putting 5 points into Tornado. This is our main ability the build is completely focused around. And one of the really good things about Tornado is it has an AoE effect, so it can hit multiple enemies with just one, but also it stays spawned in for a few seconds, and we're going to be spamming these out constantly. So every single one of these is going to be moving around, constantly proccing new damage hits on every enemy it hits, which is just going to be proccing a ton of our effects very consistently. Upgrade 1, every time we cast a Tornado, we have a 20% chance to spawn an additional one, so just multiplying our damage. Upgrade 2, Tornado has a chance to cause enemies to become vulnerable, and since tornadoes are constantly dealing damage over and over again, this is actually going to apply vulnerable a lot more of the time than you would normally think 10% would give you. Then down to our defensives, we have Cyclone Armor, gives us non-physical damage reduction. Then when you activate, it knocks all enemies back for some damage. Upgrade 1, when we activate it, all the enemies that are knocked back are slowed. This is actually one of the primary reasons we're taking this, because you can knock all enemies back and slow them very heavily to keep them away from you. To be able to kill them at range, you're not just getting destroyed by their melee damage. Upgrade 2, every 10 seconds you get a big damage reduction. Then 1 point in a Blood Howl, it's just a pretty big heal. Upgrade 1, every time you kill something, reduces the cooldown by 1 second. Upgrade 2, you gain 15% increased attack speed for 4 seconds. And this is more primarily going to be used for the attack speed we get, and another one of our aspects is also going to give us increased critical strike chance after we use Blood Howl. So this is more going to be used for a damage increase, but constantly being able to use this because of the cooldown reduction is also going to allow us to keep ourselves topped up. Then we're going down and taking Hurricane, only 1 point into this, and this did recently get buffed, so even though it's only 1 point, this still deals quite a lot of damage. Upgrade 1, this slows enemies damage by it. Upgrade 2, it makes enemies deal 20% less damage after being damaged by it. And one of the best parts of Hurricane is since our storm skills are werewolf skills, this can proc a ridiculous amount of effects. Then we're going down and taking Grizzly Rage. Our build is very focused around being in Grizzly Rage as long as possible. We have Unstoppable on this, which is our main way to become unstoppable. We constantly gain damage increases with this, and then all of our other effects from our aspects. Upgrade 1, we're unstoppable. Upgrade 2, we constantly gain Fortify every second this is active. This is also one of our main way of generating Fortify, and will be very heavily fortified the majority of the time with this build. Then our capstone is Perfect Storm. Storm skills that you cast grant 1 spirit and deal 15% increased damage when damaging a vulnerable, immobilized, or slow target. So increased damage to basically everything, and we'll be spamming out such a ridiculous amount of tornadoes that this ends up being a pretty big spirit generator. And like I mentioned, this is a base version of this build, but there are versions of this build that actually use Earthen Might instead, and it completely changes up how this build feels to play. And I'll probably be going over multiple versions of this build, but that's just one of the options you could do to completely change up this build for different content you're trying to complete. And then next up we have our passives, 1 into Heart of the Wild, so we can get 3 into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost more, but deal a lot more damage, just a decent damage increase. Then 3 into Predatory Instinct, critical strike chance increase when enemies are close. If enemies are close to you, they're usually something that's going to be surviving longer, so having more critical strike is going to be very good for that. Then 3 into increased movement speed while we're in werewolf form. Always going to be in werewolf, and more speed is always going to be good. Then we're going down taking 1 into Ancestral Fortitude, non-physical resistance is increased, and then 3 into Vigilance. After we use a defensive, 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds, and with how much we can spam Blood Howl, this will be up quite a lot of the time. Then we're going down 1 point into Elemental Exposure. It's a lucky hit. Your storm skills have up to a 10% chance to make enemies vulnerable. Just another way to apply vulnerable. We have a few different ways that can apply vulnerable, and all that mixed together makes enemies become vulnerable majority of the time. Then 2 into Endless Tempest, increase the duration of Hurricane by 10%, so this is up to 9 seconds. This is primarily so Hurricane can stay active more to proc a bunch of our effects. Then I put 3 points into Bad Omen, a lucky hit up to 30% chance when dealing damage to vulnerable, immobilized, or stun enemies to spawn a lightning bolt that does a pretty big chunk of damage. And keep in mind, this damage value it's showing is base damage, so these lightning bolts can actually do quite a lot of damage. And this is something I'm actually testing out to see how good it will be. I've taken some points from some other passives that I don't think are as useful to put into this. And then we're going down taking 1 into Neurotoxin. This is primarily to put 3 into Envenom. Poison enemies take 60% increased critical strike damage, a multiplicative scalar, so very high damage increase. We also have 3 additional ranks on our necklace. Then 1 into Toxic Claw, critical strikes with werewolf skills, poison enemies over 4 seconds. And you only want 1 point into this. We don't actually care about the poison damage itself. We primarily just want enemies to be poisoned, which can proc a lot of our other effects. And for something like Hurricane, this is also a werewolf skill, so we can just pop Hurricane and run by enemies, and it'll basically poison all enemies we run by very quickly. Then we're going down 3 points into Defiance. Nature skills deal increased damage to elites, very good, more multiplicative scaling. Then Circle of Life, skills that consume spirit, heal you for 3% of your maximum life. And since we're going to be spamming out spirit costing abilities in our tornado very quickly and all the time, we're going to be healing quite a lot just from Circle of Life. Then we're putting 3 points into Defensive Posture, increases the amount of Fortify you gain by 15%. This is primarily to help us stay very fortified from Grizzly Rage. Then we have 1 point in a Nature's Resolve, 5% chance when struck to fortify you for 4% of your base life. Now I took 2 points out of this to put in some more of these storm skills, and with some more testing, I may actually remove this last point and go put it into Endless Tempest so our Hurricane has even more duration. But I still want to do some testing to see if I'm able to stay very highly fortified without this Nature's Resolve. And then next up we have our Spirit Boons. Starting off we have Wariness, take reduced damage from elites, the primary things that can kill you. Then we have Swooping Attacks, increase attack speed by 10%. Attack speed is actually really important for this build because we can spam Tornado so much. We want attack speed to be able to spam it much more quickly. Then Calamity, increase the duration of our ultimate skills by 25%. Grizzly Rage is a massive focus, so we can always spam tornadoes, so we want to stay in that as long as possible. Then we have Masochistic, critical strikes with shapeshifting skills, heal you for 3% of your maximum life. Now you can kind of start to realize how ridiculous this will actually be, because if we have something like Hurricane and there's a big group of enemies around us, anytime it crits on any enemy, that's a 3% maximum life heal. Then we have something like Tornado, though we could have dozens of these things out at a time, them all hitting multiple enemies. Every time they crit, that's another big heal. So you'll see sometimes just a couple tornadoes could spam heal 100% of your life in seconds. And then one of the most important parts of the build, Calm Before the Storm, a lucky hit. Nature skills have up to a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate by 2 seconds, just allowing us to be in Grizzly Rage as much as humanly possible. And then next up we have our Paragon boards, and like normal, I'm primarily going to be going over our build selection and our glyph choices, but I'll have a link in the description to a Diablo 4 build planner so you can go through it and look at every single point I'm taking. It'll just take a little bit too long to go over all of this in a video. So first board, we're going with Werewolf, increase damage while in werewolf form from all willpower within range. Then you take damage reduction while in werewolf form, just massive damage increase basically all the time, and then damage reduction all the time. Then our first board is going to be Ancestral Guidance. After spending 75 Spirit, you will deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. We're going to be spending lots of Spirit and generating lots of Spirit all the time, so this is going to be a pretty big damage increase. Then on this board, we're taking the Spirit Glyph, increase critical strike damage with core skills, and then critical strikes increase the damage an enemy takes from you by 2% up to 12% for 20 seconds. And we actually don't have a lot of points put into this specific glyph. This is one of the places I want to test around with to see if there's some ways that I can get more points into this glyph to get more critical strike damage with our core skills. Then we're going to be going over to the right, taking Lust for Carnage. This is pretty important. Critical strikes with werewolf skills restore 2 spirit, and you can see how this could be pretty ridiculous. Through a hurricane, through all of our tornadoes out, you can just regenerate ridiculous amounts of spirit just based off of our tornado damage. And I would say if you're earlier on, it may even be worth to take Lust for Carnage as your first board and get this as quickly as possible just because of how much spirit this is actually going to be able to give you. Then on this board, we're taking the Undaunted Glyph, which is increased damage while fortified, massive increased damage. We're fortified all the time, so this is just one of the biggest damage increases from our Paragon boards. Then you take up to 10% damage reduction depending on how much fortify you have, so just massive damage reduction and then massive damage increase basically all of the time. Then we're going down and taking Heightened Malice. While 3 or more enemies are poisoned near you, you deal 45% increased damage, and like a lot of these other effects, it's a multiplicative, so this is a very big damage increase. But then we're going to go back up to our first board, and above that, we're going to take the Thunderstruck board. Storm skills deal 30% increased critical strike damage against vulnerable or immobilized enemies, so another pretty big damage increase. Then we're going to be taking the Earth and Sky Glyph, grants a bonus to all magic nodes within range. Then nature skills deal increased damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies as a secondary, and you're going to want to be taking most of the magic nodes within range. This is going to be giving us some pretty big storm skill damage increase, some damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, and I've also taken some additional dexterity within here because it massively improves how much dexterity. That's 21 dexterity for 2 Paragon points, and I did this so I could get the secondary effect of a lot of the rare nodes in the board, because some of these, say for instance for Feral, we want to have the secondary effect of this, and then even down here we want the secondary effect of this for more poison resistance. That's primarily why I took the dexterity within this glyph. Then finally we're going over to the right, taking the Constricting Tendrils node, but we're not taking the legendary effect, and we're going to be taking the Exploit Glyph, increase vulnerable damage. But the primary thing we want from this is when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This has a 20-second cooldown per enemy. So now the first time you damage any enemy, they're instantly vulnerable, which is going to massively increase our burst damage. So that takes us to our gear, and we've already gone over the one unique we're using for this build. That's pretty much the only unique you're going to want to be using. You can use the unique chest piece that makes Werewolf your true form and gives +2 ranks to all werewolf skills. That one is good, but if you're trying to do higher nightmare dungeons or much more difficult content like the Pinnacle boss, you're going to want a legendary chest piece with a lot of damage reduction on it. But that brings us to our legendary aspects. On our weapon, critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by up to 25% for 5 seconds. This will be procced all the time, and like I mentioned, attack speed is very important for this build. And I've been using an axe which has the implicit of damage to healthy enemies, but I may want to test out using some different weapons to see how it feels compared to this. But you do want a one-handed, so we can also have an offhand, and on our offhand we have Bloodhowl increases critical strike chance by up to 10%. So now when we cast our Bloodhowl, we're getting 10% crit and 15% attack speed. Massive damage increases. Then on our necklace, we already went over Grizzly Rage turned us into Dire Werewolf. This is one of the most important parts of the build, so we can spam out our tornadoes while in Grizzly Rage. Then increases the duration of Grizzly Rage by 5 seconds, and you gain a stack and critical strike damage increase for every time you critically strike. This is also just going to continue to ramp our damage the entirety of the time we're in Grizzly Rage. This is going to give us massive damage increases. Then your core skills deal up to 40% increased damage based on your Fortify. I'd actually use this from the Codex of Power, but you want to get a high roll on this because this is more multiplicative scaling, so this is going to be a pretty big damage damage increase. Then on our gloves, tornadoes will seek up to 3 targets, so now tornadoes actually have some form of tracking, makes the build much easier to use. Then on our chest piece, basic skills grant damage reduction for up to 6 seconds. This is primarily because we're also getting damage reduction from Storm Strike, so every 3 seconds you want to be using Storm Strike so you can get 25% from Storm Strike itself and another 20% damage reduction from our aspect. That's a massive damage reduction that you can basically continuously have active, you just have to get good at tracking it. Then on our legs, we want the increased armor scaling, so up to 50% increased armor based off our damage, and we're doing tons of damage hits because of how many tornadoes will be out, so this will stay stacked up pretty effectively. Then on our boots, while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain up to 25% increased movement speed and can freely move through enemies. Now this is very strong, you should probably get a better roll than I have. You can gain massive movement speed while we're in Grizzly Rage because we're unstoppable in Grizzly Rage the whole time, and then you can freely move through enemies, meaning you're just going to be faster and you can't get trapped by enemies. This is a very good utility aspect. And then finally we have our statting, starting off with our gems. In our main and offhand, we want critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. In our armor, we want damage reduction while fortified. This is going to be a pretty big damage reduction overall. Then in our jewelry, we want increased armor just for a pretty big damage reduction from physical. And then for our gear statting itself, on the chest piece, we want basically anything that's going to make us tanky. This is actually one of the pieces I could upgrade quite a bit. Damage reduction from distant enemies, very good. Damage reduction while fortified, very good. Total armor and maximum life are pretty good, but you want damage reduction from poison enemies, damage reduction from close enemies. Those are generally going to be better than the total armor and max life, but total armor and max life are still pretty decent rolls. Then on our gloves, attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance are 3 of the best rolls. Willpower is decent, but the primary thing I would want for these gloves is to change willpower over to plus ranks to tornado, so I can get a pretty big upgrade on my gloves. So the top 4 rolls are ranks to tornado, attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance. That's going to be your best rolled gloves. Then on our legs, basically the exact same thing as our chest piece. Damage reduction from distant enemies, damage reduction from poison enemies, damage reduction while fortified. I have total armor, but something like damage reduction from close enemies would also be really good. And also damage reduction while injured, I think is something I may want to try out. I think that roll is actually pretty underrated for a build like this that can heal so much. Then on our boots, movement speed, total armor while in Werewolf, both are top rolls. Damage reduction while injured, also very good and one of the top rolls for boots. Also one of the reasons I want to try it on legs as well. I have all stats on this, which is a decent roll, but you would generally want some more damage reduction. Then on our weapon, I actually got pretty lucky on my axe roll. Damage increase to close enemies, willpower, vulnerable damage, and core skill damage are going to be probably your top 4 rolls, but anything else that massively increases damage is going to be pretty good here, but I do think these are probably the top 4 rolls. Then on our offhand, critical strike, lucky hit chance, cooldown reduction, damage reduction while fortified, all going to be probably the best rolls. And then you're also getting that pretty big cooldown reduction from the implicit on the offhand as well. Then on our necklace, movement speed very good, damage reduction while fortified very good, and ranks to Envenom, all going to be top rolls. I would want to change this werewolf skill damage to probably damage reduction from poisoned enemies or any other very tanky stat. Then on our rings, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, maximum life, and then vulnerable damage. And I don't have vulnerable damage on either of my rings, so both of my rings can get some pretty big upgrades. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.